A few years back, I reviewed the M10 filter system that Haida very generously sent to me to test, and I was so impressed with it that I've continued to use this to this day. However, they've now released an updated Mk2 version that they've again sent me to review. Now, I was somewhat puzzled by the news that they'd released a new version, given that I didn't really have any complaints about the Mk1. So I was curious as to what possible improvements could they have made. Now, at first glance, it doesn't seem like there is much difference, and in reality they are the same basic design, same materials, exactly the same size, to the point that you can actually swap the adapter plates and the rear drop filters between the two versions. Arguably, the most obvious difference is the enlarged felt padding on the front face. Now, this is there to stop light from leaking in behind your filters. I've personally never experienced any light leakage from using the Mk1, but hey, more protection can't be a bad thing. The next most obvious change is the redesign of the release mechanism. On the Mk1, there is a tab that you have to pull out in order to fit or remove the holder from the adapter plate. On the Mk2, it switches to a push mechanism. Now, this is a bit of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, literally, you can mount this with just one hand, as you only really need a finger to activate the mechanism. So it's not only easier to mount and release it, but you can also do it without taking off your gloves, because you don't have to pinch anything, which is especially handy if you're, say, somewhere very cold. The drawback to a push mechanism, however, is that while it's easier to intentionally remove the holder, it's also easier to unintentionally knock the release tab and drop the whole thing. The solution to this can be found on the opposite side with change number 3, a locking nut that's there to stop the holder from rotating on the adapter ring. Both versions of these holders can rotate quite easily on the adapter ring, which is great if you want your filters at an angle to the rest of the camera. However, it does mean you could potentially knock them into a different position. The Mk2's locking nut lets you then set the holder in a position that you want, and then you can lock it off so that it can't be accidentally moved. Finally, change number 4 for this holder is the holders themselves. They're not only shorter on the Mk2, but the grip mechanism's been revamped, which means the filters can now slide into the holder a little bit easier than before, but they still aren't going to be easily knocked out of place. Now, both versions of these, by default, out of the box, you get slots for 2 100mm filters plus the drop slot behind. And to be honest, this has always been enough for me. However, there is included a 3-slot piece which you can swap onto the holder if you'd prefer. Now, this does make the holder a bit deeper and potentially a bit trickier to store, but it obviously has the upshot that you then have room for an extra 100mm filter. However, and you may have already spotted this, on the Mk1, there are 3 small screws on each side, which you need to remove to take off the current pieces and then screw on the replacements. Not the easiest thing to do when you're out in the field. The Mk2, by comparison, has no screws. These just simply slide off. I say just, you still have to put a bit of force into them to get them fully in place, which is good, because it means they aren't accidentally going to fall off. But it does mean that swapping these from a 2 to a 3 slot piece can be done in all of about 30 seconds and doesn't require any tools. So you could just leave the 2 slot on for easier storage if you wanted, knowing that the 3 slot is right there and could be easily swapped out if you happen to need them. So that's all the changes for the holder itself. As for the drop-in trays, the standard blank drop-in that you have just to stop excess light when you don't want a filter, that's remained entirely unchanged. The CPL drop-in, however, has seen some improvements, and I presume that these improvements also apply to the other drop-in filters available as well. For starters, it's now made of metal rather than plastic like the older ones, and that's metal everything. Well, apart from the glass, obviously. The body of the filter holder, the pinch release, even the release clamps on the side are now metal rather than plastic, so definitely a step up in the build department. The wheel on the top that is used to rotate the filter has now been made a fraction larger. Not by much, but definitely slightly wider in diameter, which just makes it a little bit easier to grip when you want to spin the CPL. And the writing on the filters has now been made much clearer as well, which is useful if you are using multiple drop-ins, as it makes it far more apparent which is which when you've got them in your storage pouch. So no individual drastic changes over the original M10, just several small revisions that take what was already a very good system and have made it even better. And that concludes this video. As always, if you have any questions or queries, please feel free to leave them in the comments down below. While you're down there, if you enjoyed this video and you haven't already done so, then please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons, and hopefully, we'll see you in the next video.